Welcome to our next study in the Gospel of Mark, a book that, as we now know, is a collection of eyewitness accounts of incidents in the life of Jesus. Today we're looking at chapter 6, verses 1 to 6, and as usual I will begin by reading this passage to you. So Mark tells us Jesus left there and went to his hometown, accompanied by his disciples. When the Sabbath came, he began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. "Where did this man get these things?" they asked. "What's this wisdom that has been given to him? What are these remarkable miracles he's performing? Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son, and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. Jesus said to them, "A prophet is not without honor except in his own town, among his relatives, in his own house." He could not do any miracles there except lay his hands on a few sick people and heal them. He was amazed at their lack of faith. In the previous section of this book, three quite remarkable events have been described by Mark. There, the accounts of the stilling of a violent storm, the remarkable story of Jesus expelling a large number of demons from a desperately troubled man, and his healing of both a half-dead woman and his restoring to life a dead child, have been recorded in considerable detail. We've already observed that together these miracles, for they were certainly that, demonstrate Jesus' authority over nature, unseen spiritual powers, and even death, the final great enemy of each one of us. So the Galilee, where Jesus conducted most of his ministry up to this point, must have been buzzing with the news of these and similar events. Indeed, we've already noticed that news had reached the royal palace at Machaerus, and very shortly we will be introduced to a vast and excited crowd of people flocking to see Jesus. Understandably, he was the news on everyone's lips, and already there were those asking questions as to who he was, amazed at what they had seen and heard. At this point Jesus returned home, and we might have expected that, as a local boy, the community in which he'd grown up would have been thrilled that all these events were being accomplished by one of their own. One might have expected that the pride of the local population would have known no bounds. And initially it appears that this is exactly what happened. Let me read the words again. When the Sabbath came, Jesus began to teach in the synagogue, and many who heard him were amazed. "Where did this man get these things?" they asked. "What's this wisdom that he's been given? What are these remarkable miracles he's performing?" Like the crowds who were already following Jesus through the Galilee, those from his hometown were struck by two things. First of all, they were amazed at his teaching. There was something unique, almost out of the world, in the quality of his teaching. Then secondly, there were the miracles that he was performing. Indeed, his fellow citizens spoke not just of miracles, but remarkable miracles. Now this is interesting. Here were a people living in a country where God had made a habit of performing awesome miraculous acts. Here was a people who were heirs of Moses and Joshua, of mighty leaders like Gideon, Samson, Saul, David, Elijah, Elisha, Daniel and his companions, of Esther and many others, people who had experienced the remarkable presence of God among them. So much so that one might almost suppose that for them the miraculous was almost normal. But here are Jesus' townsfolk recognizing that what was taking place was such that it was unparalleled even in their history and experience. So far, so good. However, can I remind you of what happened next? Mark tells us that they asked, "Isn't this the carpenter? Isn't this Mary's son and the brother of James, Joseph, Judas, and Simon? Aren't his sisters here with us?" And they took offense at him. I think we probably need to read between the lines here. Reference to Mary's son without reference, as would have been expected, to his paternity may hint at the fact that Mary had borne Jesus out of wedlock, a story fully described in the Gospels of Matthew and Luke. Put less politely then, they appear to have been referring to Jesus as a bastard. And goodness me, up till now, he'd only been the town's construction specialist. Scarcely an occupation to place him among the great and the good. So instead of welcoming him, they were offended by this upstart. How dare he speak as he was speaking, and perform miracles as he was doing? It was simply outrageous. Why, however, does Mark include this story here? I think we can work out his reasons by reflecting upon the purpose of his book. Right from the start, Mark has made it clear that he wants us to come to accept his claims, backed by all the evidence he's assembled and repeated, that Jesus was God in human flesh, God incarnate, and the promised deliverer of our world from all those things that inhibit our relationship with God. However, even those who heard Jesus speak and saw what he did not always welcome him. And so the natural question is to ask, why? And I suggest Mark included this story to explore the problem of the blinkered mind and its consequences, a problem that still prevails today, even perhaps among some of us who may be listening to this study. Mark's point is therefore that if our minds are blinkered, we cannot experience the full disclosure of Jesus' person and power. There's no suggestion here that the inhabitants of Nazareth were willful in their rejection of Jesus. Initially they offered a welcome. However, the key to understanding their problem lies in the words that we've just read. These people thought they knew all that was to be known about Jesus. He was, as we have seen, a local lad, well known as the local builder, a mere artisan like some of them, uneducated and of doubtful parentage. They couldn't deny his wisdom and miraculous powers, but failing to be able to reconcile this with what they knew about him, they stuck with the familiar, with what they did understand. Put simply then, they were not open-minded enough to move from where they were to where Jesus' words and actions were encouraging them to go. Mark suggests then that we may need to think outside the box when we encounter the Jesus of this gospel. Only if we do so will we begin to perceive that he just might be the one Mark believed him to be. But there are other lessons to learn from this story. Specifically, there were 3 consequences that followed from the failure of the inhabitants of Nazareth to really engage with the challenge that Jesus brought them. First of all, their blindness seems to have increased. They never even began to understand who Jesus was, and therefore they were unable to experience the fullness of Jesus' power at work among them. And there's a double warning here to us today. On the one hand, it's possible to be locked into a worldview which makes it impossible to see Jesus for who he is. We think we have got a handle on Jesus. Our culture and background may have got Jesus sorted, and as a result we can fail to know him as he really is. But secondly, the condition described here is inexplicable. How could those who heard Jesus speak and see his miracles have failed to have sought to penetrate the mystery of who he was and is? The reality is, however, as Mark knew too well, that it is all too common. So the response of the townsfolk was not surprising, but it was genuinely shocking. Jesus' response indicates that such blindness makes no sense. To reject Jesus meant to disregard significant evidence, and the same remains true today. We have the stories of Jesus, and many of us have met with those who demonstrate the sort of transformed life that Jesus promises, and attracted even debauched Herod to John, as we shall soon see. We know of those whose life stories indicate that Jesus can be trusted in situations which we would fear ourselves to enter. So Not to consider Jesus is inexplicable. The evidence for who he claims to be is so strong, but we all too often follow the same path as the residents of Nazareth. Finally, I want you to notice that failure to receive the truth of Jesus brings great grief to him. His astonishment was surely tinged with the sharpest of grief. Jesus came in love to his own, and even his own did not receive him. And he comes still in love by his Spirit, inviting us to open ourselves up to the fullness of all he is, and to experience the abundance of grace that flows from him. How much our blindness must grieve him. Finally then, this passage declares a double message. We should not be surprised when people fail to respond to the claims of Jesus. Inexplicable as it is, Jesus had the same experience. Equally, however, we should be very sure that we are always open to the fullness of God's revelation to us in Jesus. He cannot be boxed and gift-wrapped, but constantly seeks to break through to us through his word and the testimonies of those who followed him, to reveal fresh dimensions of who he is. And the question we must face is surely this: are we big enough to face the challenge that this brings?